What's up, friends? Welcome to Drop-Ins with Dr. Awesome. I am Dr. Awesome, and this is the down and dirty quick tutorial on how to shoot video with the Canon Rebel T7i. So obviously the first thing you want to do is go ahead and put this camera together, and to do that you take the cap off the back of the lens, take the cap off the body of the camera, and then you'll see on the lens here we have this little white dot. There is a corresponding white dot on the body of the camera, and all you got to do is line those up and then turn the lens till it clicks into place. Next thing we're gonna do is go ahead and put a battery in the camera. So I'm gonna go ahead and go to top down here again. On the bottom of the camera here on the grip, there's this little door here. You just pop that open. You take your battery. You can see it's got a little arrow that indicates which way is down. You can just slide that in. Slide that in. And close the door. And from here we're going to put the SD card in, which is on the grip as well. On the side here, you just slide that over and pull it to open. SD card goes with the labeling towards the back side of the camera. Push it in and close the door. Now we're about ready to start here, but before we even turn this camera on, I want to draw your attention to something, and that's going to be this knob right here on the top. So if you look at this knob, what you'll see is there's all these different settings, and each of those settings is going to make this camera behave a little differently. For the purposes of this tutorial, the only one that really matters is the one that says M. That stands for manual. That's going to give you the most control over this camera. There are a myriad of settings when you would want to use these other functions, but when you're first getting started with this camera, it's really important to kind of understand how things work to get better at it. So again, I'm going to go ahead and recommend manual. How you set the camera to manual is you just take this dial and you turn it like this, and you make sure that little M is lined up with this little white line right here, and then right next to this dial you have your power switch. You can see it says off, on, and then it has this like camera picture. Because we are shooting video, that's the one we're going to use. So go ahead and slide this all the way up, and we are good to go. Now, once you've got this camera on, just like a traditional camcorder, there's a number of things that we want to adjust. We're going to want to adjust our frame rate and shutter speed, and f-stop, and ISO, all of those things. But before we do any of those things, we're going to go ahead and format our memory card. Now remember, the reason we format our memory cards is it gets rid of all the stuff that's on the card, so you've got more room, and it also prevents data fragmentation. Now, you gotta be careful with this though. Make sure you've backed up your card before you format it, because once you format it, everything that's on it is gone. And so how you format a card on this camera is you hit your menu button, and then you'll see these different options here. The one we're looking for is function settings. It's got the little wrench icon. Go ahead and select that, and then the fourth option down is going to be format card. Go ahead and hit that, slide over to OK, hit OK, and you've now formatted the card. Like I said, there are a bunch of other things that we're going to adjust here. The first we're going to start with is going to be frame rate. Now, if you look at this camera here, how you adjust your frame rate, the easiest way to do it is this button that has the Q on it. Go ahead and hit that, and then over here on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see this icon right here. It may not say FHD when you pull it out of the box, but that's what you're going to be looking for, is that second icon on the left-hand side. And once you get that selected, you can see there's a myriad of options for frame rates here, but really the only ones that matter are the ones that say FHD. That stands for full HD. And within that category, you'll notice we have 2997, which is 30 frames a second. We've got 5994, which is 60 frames a second, and we've got 2398, which is 24 frames a second. Now, depending on what you're shooting, different frame rates are going to produce different looks. 24 is sort of the standard for film and cinema, so like movies and documentaries, things like that. 30 is the standard for news and television broadcast, and then 60 is sort of more for like fast motion, where you're really trying to capture a lot of different motion. It's also really great if you're looking to start jumping into like beginning slow motion stuff. Basically, the more frames per second you have, the smoother your motion is going to look. Now, I'm going to go ahead and set this camera to 30 by just cycling through and finding FHD 2997, and I'm going to hit set over here, and then we are good to go. the next thing we're talking about is shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is one of the primary methods of lighting control for any camera, and how you adjust it on this camera is this little wheel right here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab this little chart here so we have something to look at. And as I turn this wheel, what you'll see is the screen gets darker or lighter. And you can also see this little number here on the very bottom left-hand side. As that number goes up and down, it corresponds to that dark or light. What this number represents is the fractions of a second your shutter is open. So the higher that number is, actually the faster your shutter is going, so the less light's coming in your camera. And so I'm going to set this. So because I've got mine set to 30 frames a second, I'm going to set my shutter speed to 1/60th of a second. Now, the question you may be asking is, why 1/60th of a second? Well, shutter speed does something more than lighting. It's also kind of how you control motion blur. And, you know, generally speaking, the rule that we try and follow is that you want your motion blur to be true to life. And how you achieve that is you have your shutter speed be twice that of your frame rate. So since I'm shooting at 30 frames a second, my shutter speed needs to be 1/60th of a second to get the truest to life motion blur. If you were shooting at 24 frames a second, with a DSLR, you'd actually set your shutter speed at like 1/50th. If you're shooting 60 frames per second, you're looking at 1/120th, so on and so forth, on, up, or around, whatever's going on. That's the general rule. Now, you can't always follow that rule. There's going to be times where to get the exposure, you have to crank it down or crank it up, or you know, you may be looking for a specific effect. But generally speaking, the higher your shutter speed, the faster your shutter speed, the less motion blur, the slower your shutter speed, the more motion blur you're going to get. Now, along with your shutter speed, you also have your f-stop. And once again, to adjust that, you turn to this little wheel on top of the camera, but this time you do something else as well. Before you can actually adjust your f-stop, you have to hit this little button right here. This is AV. And then, once you hit that button and hold it, you can turn that wheel, and again, what you'll see is the screen is getting darker and lighter depending on what's going on, and this other number down here on the bottom is going up or down depending on what I'm doing. Now, the f-stop, or the aperture, is, like I said, another way that we control light coming in the camera. Basically, the higher that number, the smaller the aperture opening, the less light's coming into your camera. The smaller that number, the wider that opening, the more light's coming into your camera. But just like shutter speed, you have to be careful with this because it doesn't just do light. Your f-stop also controls your camera's depth of field. Now, depth of field is the distance between the closest and farthest things in a given shot that can be considered to be in focus, right? So the higher your f-stop, the less light's coming in, the longer your depth of field. The smaller that number, the more open your aperture is, the shallower your depth of field becomes. So if you're looking to get that sort of cinematic look, what you want to do is try and always have your f-stop be as low as possible, which with this camera is f4. Once we've moved on from shutter speed and f-stop and all of that, if you still can't get the exposure you're looking for, there is one more lighting tool we need to talk about, and that is ISO. Now, some people call this ISO, but I refuse, and the reason I refuse is because it's not an acronym. The ISO values are set by the International Organization of Standardization, but that would be iOS, and so, like I said, I refuse. Basically what ISO is the same thing as gain on a traditional camcorder. It's just how sensitive your camera is to light. Now, it's not letting more or less light in, it's just making your camera work with what's coming into it. So you gotta be careful with it. But to adjust your ISO, again, we're gonna look at this wheel here, but we also have to hit this little button here on top of the camera that says ISO. Once you hit that button, you'll see this gauge appear, and you can turn that up or down as you need to. Now, like I said, you have to be careful with this because there's not any more light coming in the camera, even though the screen is getting brighter. It's just working harder with the light that it's given. So really, I wouldn't recommend ever getting above this 1600 mark here. You're going to want to try and keep this as low as possible to get your exposure. If you ever get above that 1600, what's going to happen is you're going to get pretty grainy footage. So we want to try and avoid that. Now, there are two more sort of visual things we need to talk about, and the first of them is white balance. Now, white balance is how your camera sees and defines color. The best choice with any camera is always to manually white balance your camera, but with the Rebel, like many DSLRs, that's a super pain in the butt. I'm actually going to have to devote an entire video on manually white balancing this camera, because it involves not only using video settings but photography settings, and you have to actually, it's a pain. It'll be its own video. So for the purposes of this tutorial, what I'm going to do is show you the sort of shortcut way to get a usable white balance, if not the perfect one. If we again hit this Q button here on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see right now it's the little incandescent light bulb. I'm going to go ahead and touch that. That's the second icon on the right-hand side. And now down at the bottom, what you'll see is a whole bunch of different options, right? You've got AWB, you've got daylight, shade, cloudy, tungsten, and as you can see, I'm going through these, the picture is looking a little different as I go through them, right? Now, like I said, the best option is manually white balancing, but in lieu of that, you can use these options, and really, as long as you're using the correct option for where you're at, they're gonna be pretty accurate. So I'm gonna go ahead and set mine to incandescent, because I'm in the studio here, or tungsten rather. Again, I'm in the studio, we got the studio lights. That's the best white balance for this room. Along with your white balance, there's one more color thing we want to look at before we move on, and that's going to be your picture profile. And so if, again, we hit our Q button here and we come down to this third icon on the right-hand side, there's, again, on the bottom, a bunch of different options here. And what I would always recommend with any DSLR is finding the neutral or flat color profiles. And the reason I recommend that, what's going to happen when you turn on that profile is your camera is going to look a little less contrasty, and your colors are going to look a little muted, and it's going to look just a little off, but it does make editing so much easier, because it's easier to get a proper exposure when things are a little flatter. You can always add in contrast, you can always add in color in post, but you can't add in more light without degrading it. So this is not a hard rule, but it's something that I try and do, and that's always shoot in a neutral color profile. Before we're ready to start recording, there is another thing we got to look at, and that is audio. Like most DSLRs, the Rebel can record audio without a microphone, but it's pretty awful, so you're going to want to put some kind of microphone on the camera. Now, it can be a shotgun mic, it can be a lav mic, it's really kind of whatever you've got available to you, but you're definitely going to want to use something to ensure you're getting better sound. So in this case, I'm going to use this lav mic here, and I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to mount it backwards for the purposes of what I'm doing here, and I'm going to slide this into the hot shoe. Like I said, I'm doing it backwards here just because it's going to work better for showing you stuff, but if you were not recording yourself from behind the camera, obviously you'd want it pointed forward. You've got on the side of the camera here this little hole that is the mic hole, mic jack, sorry. That just goes in there. Turn the mic on. Now, in a lot of cases when you're first getting started, you might want to just sort of leave the audio settings on auto, but if you want to try and get a more professional sound, you want to sort of dial that sound in, what you're going to want to do, I'm going to flip this out so we can kind of see it here, is you're going to want to go to your menu, and then on those shooting settings, you want to go down to sound recording, and then set it to manual. And then your record level, you can take up or down as you need to make sure that it's sort of hitting in that -12 zone that most cameras find to be the optimal volume for recording. And once you've done that, you hit OK, close your menu out, and we are ready to start actually shooting something. I'm going to go ahead and take this microphone off just so it's not in the way of the rest of our little tutorial here. Before you start recording, you obviously want to focus the camera. And so in a lot of cases with camcorders, what we recommend doing is, zooming all the way in, which on this camera you can see we have 18 to 55 here. How you would zoom is you would just turn this ring so that the lens zooms. So like I said, with camcorders, we tend to recommend zooming all the way in, focusing up, and then zooming back out to your desired shot. With DSLRs, specifically some of these lower-end, entry-level DSLRs, I don't recommend that because these lenses don't have fixed apertures as you're zooming, so you get what's called focus compression, and what's in focus at one zoom length may not be in focus at another. And so what you would do if you're using manual focus is you would, if you wanted to get closer to something, you'll see over here on the right-hand side this little magnifying glass. You would hit that, and then you can zoom in on something and turn this very outer ring of the camera here to get things in focus. One cool thing about the Rebel is that it does have a really pretty accurate autofocus system. Now, for a lot of stuff, I of course would not recommend using autofocus, but if you're ever doing like, the vlog thing, or you're recording like somebody walking down a hallway and you want to try and track that focus, the autofocus is an option. And so on the side of the lens here, you see we've got AF and MF. I'm gonna go ahead and slide that down to AF. And one of the cool things about this is you can actually, so if I come back up here, one of the cool things about this is not only will it track faces automatically, but you can actually hit on the touch screen, and it will then track the focus of whatever you've touched, which is a really cool feature. Again, for most things, interviews, stuff like that, I would definitely recommend shooting in manual focus. But if you're going to do the vlog thing or you need to track focus, the autofocus does work pretty well. You just have to watch it. Lastly, to actually start recording, all you got to do is hit this button right here. And you'll notice this little light here will start flashing. It'll show a record indicator on the screen. And that's how you record. To stop, hit the button again. If you want to review your footage, which of course I do recommend, what you'll do is hit this button right here. It has a little play icon on it, and then just use the touchscreen to do as you need. And that is, like I said, the down and dirty, quick tutorial on how to shoot video with really any DSLR, but specifically in this case, the Canon Rebel T7i. As with anything, you're not going to be an expert the first time you pull this camera out. You're going to have to practice with it. It takes a little bit of getting used to, especially if you're used to using a more traditional camcorder, but there's a lot of cool stuff you can do with it. So go ahead and check one out and start working with it and see what you can do. If you have any questions about this camera or any of our other gear, please feel free to contact me. My email address is WrightCI, that's WRIGHTCI @longwood.edu. Or if you're on campus, feel free to stop by my office, talk to me, we'll make it happen. That being said, that's all I got. Keep shooting, friends.